So I want to talk about shame.
Ok, želim da govorim o stidu.
And there is a history to people in Gestalt therapy needing to talk about shame.
Postoji istorija ljudi u Gestalt terapiji koji imaju potrebu da govore o stidu.
That in the early days of Gestalt therapy, there were a lot of very fierce Gestalt therapists and trainers.
U ranim godinama Gestalt terapije bilo je mnogo neustrašivih Gestalt terapeuta i trenera
who had a very clear idea of what somebody should look like in their contacting.
koji su imali vrlo jasnu ideju kako bi neko trebalo da izgleda i da bude u kontaktu.
And it's what you were talking about.
To je ono o čemu si ti govorila.
Had to be clear, know what they wanted, not accept any bullshit.
Treba biti jasan, znati šta oni žele, ne prihvatiti nikakve gluposti.
Never hold back from anything.
Nikad se ne povući ni iz čega.
Never feel shame.
Nikad se ne osjetiti postiđeno.
People became like that.
Ljudi su postali takvi.
But not because they really were in touch with who they were and what they wanted.
Ali ne zato što su bili zaista u kontaktu sa onim ko oni jesu i ono što su želeli.
But as a survival mechanism to survive those therapists.
Već kao mehanizam preživljavanja kako bi preživjeli te terapeute.
I would want to say that mostly Fritz Perls didn't do that.
A želim da istaknem da Fritz Perls uglavnom to nije radio.
But he was willing to confront very heavily, and what people took from that was people always had to know what they wanted.
On je veoma snažno konfrontirao klijente, ali ono što su ljudi iz toga uzeli, what they took from it is
that they always had to be completely clear what they want.
A ljudi su toga uzeli da oni moraju uvek da budu potpuno jasni šta žele.
And some people are just not in sensory contact enough with the world to know what is available and what they want there.
A neki ljudi nisu jednostavno u senzornom, odnosno čulnom kontaktu sa svetom kako bi znali šta žele i šta je to sve tu.
And that way of pushing people actually took them even more away from their senses and their ability to form a figure in the world.
I takav način guranja ljudi ih još dodatno udaljava od svojih čula i formiranja figure u svetu.
Does that make sense to people?
Da li vam to ima smisla?
So a number of people led by, I guess, Gary Yontef and Lynn Jacobs and Rich Heisner questioned this way of working.
Solidan broj ljudi, uključujući Jontefa, Lynn Jacobs, Rich Heisner, su počeli da preispituju ovakav način rada.
And said that what was being done was shaming the clients into being who you wanted them to be.
Rekli su da je u stvari postiđivanje klijenata, ovakav način rada je postiđivanje klijenata i na taj način teranje da budu ono što mi želimo da budu od njih.
And that therapists and trainers and supervisors had to actually learn how not to develop people by using shame in that way.
I da treneri, terapeuti, supervizori treba da nauče kako da ne razvijaju ljude na taj način kroz postiđivanje.
I, having experienced the other side, I very strongly agree with that.
Ja imam iskustvo s druge strane i snažno se slažem s tim.
That was the sort of primary way around that Gestalt therapy worked in the late 70s when I first came across it.
I to je bio primaran način rada Gestalt terapije 70-ih kad sam se ja i susreo s Gestaltom.
But I think that there are two problems.
Ali mislim da tu postoje dva problema.
That first of all, it shared with the previous way the idea that feeling shame was somehow wrong.
Prvo, deli sa prethodnim načinom tu ideju da je osjećanje stida nekako pogrešno.
Whereas what was actually being said was that people were adjusting themselves to what the therapist or trainer wanted in order to avoid feeling the shame.
Ono što je u stvari bilo rečeno je da se klijenti ili edukanti prilagođavaju terapeutu onome što u stvari ovi žele da čuju.
And when I first learned psychopathology, the definition of somebody who never felt shame was a psychopath.
A kad sam ja prvi put učio psihopatologiju, definicija nekog ko nikad ne osjeća stid jeste psihopata.
It wasn't hopefully what we were aiming to create.
Jer ja se nadam da to nije bilo ono što smo mi ciljali da stvorimo.
But there have been ways of doing therapy that I've seen that, in a sense, aim towards turning people into psychopaths.
Ali sam video načine rada gde je zaista delovalo da je cilj pretvaranje ljudi u psihopate.
And I didn't want that either.
A nisam ni to želao.
Okay. Does that make sense to people?
Da li vam to ima smisla?
So the second thing is that it was always pointing to what was being done by the person who was shaming somebody.
Aha, a druga stvar je uvek se uperivalo prstom u osobu, to je šta je uradila ta osoba koja je posramila nekog drugog, postidela.
It never asked what is the process of shame for the person who experiences it.
Nikad se nije postavljalo pitanje kakav je proces stida za osobu koja doživljava stid.
And once again, that was a kind of parallel process.
I ponovo to je bila neka vrsta paralelnog procesa.
Because if somebody's being a bully, they're saying what I do is important and the other person is just a passive victim.
Jer kada neko nekog zlostavlja, on kaže ovo što ja radim je bitno, ovaj drugi je samo pasivna žrtva.
And so the therapist is there paralleling the worldview of the bully.
Tako da terapeuti faktički prave paralelni svet sa zlostavljačima.
And what was said was anything else would be blaming the victim.
A sve drugo bi bilo krivljivanje žrtve.
But what we have in Gestalt therapy is an understanding of responsibility as ability to respond.
A ono što imamo u Gestalt terapiji je razumevanje odgovornosti kao sposobnosti da odgovorimo.
And that is not additive.
A to nije nešto što je additive. Ne, additive.
It's not what percentage is yours, what percentage is mine.
Ne može da se kvantifikuje, ovaj procenat je tvoj i moj, znači kao da se dopunje procentualno.
Everybody is 100% response able.
Svi su 100% odgovorni u stanju da odgovore.
So to give back awareness of the activity of the person who feels shame doesn't take away from the responsibility of the person who's doing the bullying.
Dakle, vratiti sposobnost aktivnosti osobi koja je posramljena ne oduzima ništa od odgovornosti osobe koja posramlje.
But it is about not being complicit in the idea of the person who feels the shame as being just a passive receiver of something.
Je važno ne posmatrati osobu koja je posramljena, postiđena samo kao pasivnog primaoca nečega.
Okay, so my interest was what is the meaning of shame for the person who feels it.
Moje interesovanje je bilo koje je osjećanje osobe koja je postiđena. Koji je značaj stida za osobu koja je postiđena?
So I started paying attention to my client's experience of shame and my experiences of shame.
Da sam počeo da obraćam pažnju na iskustvo stida mojih klijenata, moje iskustvo stida.
And I also read what Gordon Wheeler wrote about shame as a rupture in the field.
Također sam čitao što je Gordon Wheeler pisao o stidu kao vrste pukotine u polju.
And putting that in more conventional Gestalt language, it's an interruption to contact.
I stavljajući ga to u uobičajeni Gestalt jezik, to bi bila neka modifikacija kontakta ili vrsta prekida kontakta.
And we have a list of interruptions to contact. So which one is it?
A mi imamo spisak koje su to modifikacije kontakta i koje je to. On se pita koje je to.
And is that a meaningful question?
I da li je to uopšte smisleno pitanje?
So I notice the body posture of shame, which is a contracting, pushing in the belly, putting down the head.
Primetio sam da je telesni stav stida, odnosno ljudi koji su postiđeni, kontrakcija stomaka i spuštanje glave napred.
And I also noticed that many people, when they were working on issues around shame, felt nausea.
Također sam primetio da ljudi koji rade na tim temama stida vrlo često osjećaju mučninu.
And the posture began to look to me very much like what I experience in my body if I'm trying not to vomit.
A ta postura je sve više i više počela da mi liči na posturu koju ja imam svaki put kad pokušavam da ne povratim.
So I started thinking about nausea and disgust and Jean-Paul Sartre.
I onda sam počeo da razmišljam o toj mučnini, o gađenju,
Jean-Paul Sartre.
Jean-Paul Sartre, da, mučnjenju Jean-Paul Sartra.
Wrote a whole book about nausea.
Nausea, yeah.
And read stuff that Fritz Perls had written about nausea as well.
I pročitao stvari koje Fritz Perls zapisao o mučnjenju takođe.
In Ego, Hunger and Aggression.
U Ego, glad i agresija.
And this is the kind of story that came out of that.
I ovo je priča koja je proizišla iz toga.
Nausea is and disgust are incredibly important to human beings.
Mučnina i gađenje su neverovatno bitni za ljudska bića.
And this is why.
A evo i zašto.
Other animals have instinctual food that they eat.
Druge životinje imaju instinktivnu hranu koju jedu.
And we know that that food is nourishing for them because otherwise the species wouldn't continue to exist.
I znamo da je ta hrana za njih hranjiva jer u suprotnom ta vrsta ne bi opstala.
It's a given.
To je dato.
The problem side of that is that if that food possibility is not available, the animal doesn't survive in that situation like pandas with bamboo.
Druga strana toga je, odnosno problematična strana toga je da ukoliko više ta hrana nije dostupna, ta životinja ne može da opstane, kao što imamo primer pande i bambusa.
Human beings in this, like in many other things, get around that by having many fewer instincts.
Ljudska bića, kao i za mnoge druge stvari, ovde imaju zaobilaženja tako što imaju manje instikata.
Which allows for a creative response to the situation that we find ourselves in.
Što nam omogućava kreativnije izbore u situacijama u kojima smo se našli.
And in different places, as I've discovered going around teaching, people eat incredibly different things.
I na različitim mjestima gde god sam držao predavanja, primetio sam da ljudi jedu neverovatno različite stvari.
But what that means is, for early human beings, they were surrounded with things that they could put in their mouths.
Ali što to znači za rane ljude? Oni su bili okruženi stvarima koje mogu da stave u svoje usta.
Some of which would nourish them, some of which would injure them, and some of which would kill them.
Neke koje bi ih nahranile, neke koje bi ih povredile, a neke koje bi ih ubile.
And no instinctual knowledge of which to eat.
I nikakvo instinktivno znanje šta jesti.
So they needed something else.
Pa im je bilo potrebno nešto drugo.
A reflex to be able to immediately bring back something which their body says no.
Refleks da izbace odmah nešto zašto je njihovo telo reklo ne, ovo ne bi trebalo da jedeš.
And you can see that disgust reflex in the youngest babies who are given who put something in their mouth or given something that they don't like.
I ovaj refleks gađenja možete vidjeti kod najmlađih beba kada im stavite u usta nešto što im se ne sviđa ili ne žele da jedu.
There's an absolutely immediate
I odmah se desi ovo. Momentalno se desi ovo.
So that is why disgust is so important. And you were telling me yesterday, Darko, about how directly taste and smell are wired into the brain, more than any other sense.
To je zašto je gađenje toliko bitno, a ti si mi, Darko, juče objašnjavao zašto su ukus i miris direktno povezani sa mozgom više nego bilo koje drugo čulo. Direktno povezani.
And there is a theory that taste and smell are the proto-sense and the others developed after that.
A postoji teorija da su u pitanju, da su miris i ukus proto čula, a da se druga čula razviju nakon njih.
So that reflex is not just used for food. If a child's told something that doesn't feel nourishing for them, their instinctual response is to throw it back and scream and kick out.
Ovaj refleks se ne koristi samo za hranu. Kada se detetu kaže nešto što mu ne prija ili mu nije hranljivo ili mu se dopada, ono odmah izbacuje to nazad, počinje da vrišti, da se buni, da viče.
So in that top picture here, I'm sorry, if you need to come around here to see it, do.
Tako, to možete vidjeti na ovoj gornjoj slici. Izvinite što se ne vidi dobro, možete prići, vidjeti je bolje.
The self is given something that is unpalatable, not disgusting, and they instinctively and reflexively return it by disgust.
Selfu je dato nešto što je nesvarljivo, što je gadno i onda momentalno, instinktivno je izbačeno kao loše.
But then there are situations in which somebody, particularly a young child, doesn't do that.
Ali postoje situacije kada neko, pre svega malo dete, to ne učini.
Either if the parent is too dangerous to have that response to.
Bilo zato što je roditelj suviše opasan pa da bi se prema njemu pokazao takav odgovor.
Or if they're not available.
Ili ako nisu dostupni.
We're not necessarily talking about bad parents.
Ne govorimo nužno da su roditelji loši.
My mother was a working single mother with 2 sons and sometimes was not available for what I wanted or pushed me away because she had other things she needed to do.
Moja majka je bila zaposlena i sama i imala je dvojicu sinova i to što me odbijala je zato što je bila zauzeta.
And she wasn't available to receive my response, my angry response to that.
I nije bila dostupna da primi moje odgovore, pre svega ljutite odgovore na nju.
So But for whatever reason, that disgust reflex, it gets inhibited.
Ali iz kogod da je to razloga, taj refleks gađenja postaje inhibiran.
But such a powerful instinctive reflex cannot be just inhibited, it can only be retroflected and turned back against the self.
Ali tako snažan je refleks ne može tek tako jednostavno biti inhibiran, već jedino može biti retroflektovan i okrenut protiv sebe.
So disgust turns into self-disgust.
Tako da se gađenje pretvara u samo gađenje.
And that is what I understand as shame, the retroflection of disgust.
I to je ono kako ja razumem stid kao retrofleksiju gađenja.
I started experimenting with that with clients and it really fitted for them.
Počeo sam da eksperimentišem s tim s klijentima i to im je zaista odgovaralo.
When people came who shouted angry criticisms at themselves internally, I'd been taught that these were all introjects from parents.
Kad bi došli ljudi koji urlaju na sebe neke mnogo loše stvari, ja sam bio edukovan i učen da su to introjekti od strane roditelja.
And they had to get angry with parents and hit them on cushions and things like that, and then it would be resolved.
I da treba da budu ljuti na roditelje i da udre jastuke i takve stvari i da će se onda stvari razrešiti.
But I realized that nowhere in my therapy training or my early experience as a therapist had I ever seen anybody change by doing that work.
Ali ono što sam shvatio da nikad u svom ranom treningu i u svom iskustvu kao terapeuta nisam primetio da je to zaista ikome pomoglo.
This might be what you were pointing to. The same work was done over and over and over again.
Ima veze sa onim što si ti pomenula da se jedan te isti rad ponavlja i ponavlja i ponavlja.
But now with this different view, we can see that as a retroflection, and if a person says to themselves, I'm useless, it's a retroflection of saying to a caregiver, you're useless.
S ovim drugačijim pogledom možemo posmatrati kao retrofleksiju, pa kako osoba kaže sebi ti si bezvredan, možemo posmatrati da u stvari želeo da kaže nekome drugom, ne, ti si bezvredan.
And what I quickly realized was that made also more energetic sense.
A ono što sam vrlo brzo shvatio je da to ima mnogo više energetskog smisla.
Because introjection is essentially low energy, I'll do it your way.
Jer je introjekcija generalno niske energije i to je ono, uradit ću na tvoj način jer je tako lakše.
Whereas these self-criticisms are highly energized and very aggressive if you try and break into them.
Dok je samo kriticizam visoko energizovan i čak vrlo agresivan ako pokušavate da probijete.
So the retroflection idea had the energy which we actually saw.
Ideja o retrofleksiji ima energiju koju smo zapravo i vidjeli.
So instead of trying to find out who told you that, I would start supporting the undoing of the retroflection.
Tako da umjesto da istražujemo ko ti je to rekao, ja bih prepočeo sa, I will start with?
The undoing of the retroflection.
Aha, sa suprotnim procesom od retrofleksije.
And of course the bad news for the therapist is guess who receives it.
I naravno, loše vesti za terapeuta su šta mislite ko će prvi da primi to što je retroflektovano?
It's so much easier to be the nicer person than your parents who tells you all the nice things.
Jer je mnogo lakše biti mnogo bolja osoba nego što su bili roditelji klijenta i uvek govoriti lepe stvari.
Although, it's also frustrating because the client only ever temporarily takes those nice things.
Iako je to vrlo frustrirajuće jer klijenti samo uzimaju trenutno, privremeno te lepe stvari.
So I'm talking about something as simple as asking the client, tell me something that you don't like about me.
Pa onda uradim nešto jednostavno time što kažem klijentu, kaži mi nešto što ti se ne sviđa u vezi mene.
And the answer is always the same. Nothing. There's nothing wrong with you. It's all me.
I odgovor je gotovo uvek isti, odnosno jeste isti, a to je ne, s tobom je sve u redu, ja nisam u redu.
Which is exactly what you'd expect from the theory.
Što je upravo ono što biste očekivali po teoriji.
So I then make it a game and say, doesn't matter. Make something up. Tell me you don't like my green hair or something.
A ja onda napravim od toga igru pa kažem, nema veze, izmisli nešto, reci da ti se ne dopada moja zelena kosa ili tako nešto.
And they can do that.
I oni to mogu da urade.
And within 2 weeks they found something they really don't like about you.
I otprilike za 2 nedelje oni otkriju nešto što im se stvarno ne sviđa u vezi mene.
Because when they say I don't like your green hair, they don't die or get punished or rejected.
Jer kad su to rekli da ne vole moju zelenu kosu, nisu ni umrli, nisu ni kažnjeni, a nisu ni odbačeni.
And as they do that, the self-criticism gets less.
I dok to rade, samokriticizam se smanjuje.
Are there any questions so far?
Ima li nekih pitanja do sad?
Does it fit with your experience?
Da li se ovo uklapa s vašim iskustvom?
It's the important thing. Don't be force-fed by me.
Ovo mi je bitno, nemojte da budete prisilno hranjeni ni od strane mene.
Is there something you don't like about me saying it?
Ima li nečeg da vam se ne sviđa u vezi mene? We'll see in 2 weeks.
I'll be gone by then.
Tad neću biti ovdje, ali we'll arrive.
Yes.
I think it's very, very important switch from introjection to retroflection because and when you were mentioning that list of interruptions of contact, how to know which one is it. But this really, really makes sense with retroflection.
Mislim da ovo ima jako smisla što ste pomenuli ovo prebacivanje sa introjekcije na retrofleksiju i kad ste pomenuli sve te, čitav spisak tih odbrana koje ste pomenjali.
I feel confused about the way of using it, but I'm very interested in finding out, in exploring it.
Okay. Is there a center to your confusion?
Osjećam se zbunjeno kako da to koristim, ali me također intrigira kako bi to moglo da koristim. A onda je Peter rekao, je li to centar tvoje konfuzije? Da li postoji centralno tvoje konfuzije?
I don't know. Just a new way of doing.
Ne znam, samo razmišljam o novom načinu rada.
All I can really say is play with it and see how it works in your experience and your client's experience.
Jedino što ti mogu reći je igraj se s tim i vidi kako to ima veze s tvojim iskustvom i iskustvom s tvojim klijentima.
Not only has it worked very well for me with my clients,
Ne samo da ovo radi dobro sa mnom i mojim klijentima,
but there is an extension of the theory that has, for the first time, meant that I am able to understand the processes behind anorexia.
ne samo što ovo ima smisla, već postoji produžetak ove teorije, jer sam zahvaljujući ovoj teoriji prvi put mogu da razumijem koji su procesi stoje iza anoreksije.
And I worked with eating disorders for many years with more or less success, but I've never had a gut sense of understanding anorexia.
Radio sam više godina sa poremećima ishrane, ali nisam imao taj osjećaj u stomaku šta se to dešava sa anoreksijom.
And we might or might not have time to get to that if that is an interest for people, but it's an extension of this theory.
Nećemo imati vremena da idemo sada tamo, možda to interesuje ljude, ali nećemo imati vremena, ali to jeste produžetak ove teorije koje sad pričam.
Any more?
Nešto još? I have a question.
Nekada se sram ne vidi baš u tom pognutom stavu non stop, nekad je kao vidi se u bljesku.
Sometimes shame cannot be seen in that posture as you said. Maybe sometimes it's like a flash.
Tako da ili kao klijent ili kao terapeut kako da on prepozna da li se igram neodgovorno sa nečim sramom ili ne znam da je tu.
So how can I recognize, am I responsibly playing with someone's shame because I don't know even if it is here, there?
Well, that happens very often because people learn not even to show the shame, just to be what is being force-fed to them.
To se vrlo često dešava zato što su ljudi naučili da ne pokazuju svoj stid, već da budu ono kako su prisilno hranjeni i naučeni da budu.
But what I find is that the simple act of slowing everything down means that the shame begins to come up.
Ono što sam ja otkrio da je jednostavno samo usporavanje bude dovoljno da stid počne da se pokazuje.
And that's precisely what was happening in the process this morning and in the dreams this morning.
I to je upravo ono što se dešavalo ovog jutra i ovim snovima ovog jutra.
And
I understand.
it always happens.
I to se uvek događa.
So I don't need to pull it out. This is the center of the theory, that it is such a primal and powerful reflex that you don't need to do anything apart from slow things down and be available.
I ono što jeste u srcu ove teorije je da je to toliko jedna primalna stvar da nemate potrebe bilo šta da izvlačite ili da se trudite da otkrivate, već je dovoljno samo usporiti i to će se pokazati.
Spomenuli ste anoreksiju, da li se odnosi na bulimiju?
You mentioned anorexia. Does that also applied to bulimia or eating too much?
It also, the same process applies to compulsive eating, but not to bulimia.
Isti proces odnosi na kompulsivno jedenje, ali ne i na bulimiju.
I tried to fit bulimia into this, and it never really fitted. And I have a sense of a very different mechanism for bulimia, which is why anorexia or compulsive eating can coincide with bulimia.
Ja sam pokušao da uklopim bulimiju sa ovom teorijom, ali nisam nikako uspeo. U ovu teoriju se uklapa to kompulsivno jedenje i anoreksija, a bulimija ne.
I mean, I'm very proud of this theory, and I would like to say it, but need to see how much time we have because I'm aware of limited time.
Ja sam vrlo ponosan na ovu teoriju, volao bih da je podelim, ali morao bih da proverim koliko još vremena imam, a ograničeno nam je vreme.
Okay. And it's written up. It's a book chapter, so you know it is available.
A već je napisano, to je deo u knjizi, tako da je dostupno i tamo da pročitate.
And if people are on academia, it's on there.
Ako su ljudi na akademiji, takođe tamo možete pročitati kao članak.
And it's called The Self and the Skin.
Zove se Self i koža. Akademija je side, vjerojatno.
So what I'd like to do is to take this one stage further because it is really quite a complex theory.
Ono što bih želeo da uradim je da pokrenem u narednu fazu jer je zaista složena teorija.
The original language wasn't so much about interruptions to contact, but about what Goodman called boundary disturbances.
Originalni jezik teorije nije bio toliko prekidima kontakta, već onome što je Goodman nazivao uznemirenjima granice ili poremećima granice.
So introjection was moving the boundary so that what belongs to somebody else now becomes mine.
Pa bi introjekcija bila pomeranje granice tako da ono što je bilo tuđe sada postaje moje.
Projection is about moving the self-other boundary so that what is mine becomes seen as somebody else's.
Pa bi projekcija bila pomeranje self druge granice da ono što je moje sada postaje tuđe.
In retroflection, I make a kind of inner boundary of doer and done to.
U retrofleksiji pravim neku vrstu unutrašnje granice onoga ko radi aktivnost i onaj ko prima tu aktivnost.
And I turn the energy from where it would otherwise go in the world towards this other side of myself.
I okrećem energiju koja je namenjena svetu ovom drugom delu sebe.
So it becomes an internal drama.
Tako da to postaje unutrašnja drama.
So this is what's happening here, that if it's a retroflection, there is a split in self. There is the one who is disgusted, who is allied with the force-feeding parent.
Dakle, to je ono što se dešava ovde, da imamo self koji je pocepan i da onaj koji se gadi je udružen sa roditeljem koji nasilno hrani,
Which is taken as the self.
koji je pak uzet, roditelj koji je pak uzet kao self.
And then there's the other side, which is the one who is disgusting, who is now the one who is taken as other and receives the disgust.
A to je druga strana onoga koji je gadan i koji se sada uzima kao drugi, odnosno gadan drugi.
Does that make sense?
Da li nam to ima smisla?
So there is also a confluence
Tako da tu postoji takođe konfluencija
with the force feeder,
sa nasilnim hraniočem
and there is a projection of the person's sense of disgust onto everybody around you.
Postoji projekcija tog osjećaja gađenja na sve oko mene
And of course, retroflection.
i naravno retrofleksija.
And maybe some introjects like you mustn't kill the other person,
I možda neki introjekti kao što su ne smeš da ubiješ drugu osobu.
but it's not mainly about introjection.
Ali ovo nije uglavnom o introjekciji.
And in that way you can see how the different boundary disturbances support each other rather than being different, being completely separate.
I na ovaj način možete vidjeti kako različiti poremeći i granice podržavaju jedni druge pre nego da su potpuno razdvojeni.
So in a larger level, you get something like Stockholm syndrome.
Na višem nivou dobijete nešto što poput stokholmskog sindroma.
Does anybody not know what Stockholm syndrome is?
Da li ima neko ko ne zna šta je stokholmski sindrom?
So it's about somebody who's a hostage or kidnapped that comes to identify with their captor.
Radi se o tome da je neko ko je talac ili je kidnapovan i koji se identifikuje sa onim koga je kidnapovao ili koga drži tu kao taoca.
And the circumstances which promote that are a sense of being completely dependent on this other person.
A okolnosti koje to podržavaju je taj osjećaj bivanja potpuno zavisnim od te druge osobe.
And that they will only keep you alive if you completely ally with them.
I da će te jedino održati u životu ako si u potpunosti udružen s njima.
And this is parallel to the shame process.
I ovo je paralelno procesu stida.
Because, I mean, what I've just described is exactly what young children have with parents.
Jer ovo što sam upravo opisao je ono što mala deca imaju sa svojim roditeljima.
They're completely dependent on them.
Potpuno su zavisni od njih.
And they have a worry of how far they can go away from them, from their attachment to the parents, and still stay alive.
And they have
a fear about...
imaju strah koliko mogu da se udalje od roditelja, da ostanu u vezi sa roditeljima.
So, in one way, this is a process which is necessary for attachment between parents and children.
Tako da je s jedne strane ovo proces koji je neophodan za privrženost i povezanost između roditelja i dece.
But can be piggybacked on by other situations where that kind of dependency and threat is recreated.
Ali može biti Kako? Da se ali da se šlepa u drugim situacijama, u situacijama pretnje.
Are there any questions on that?
Ima li nekih pitanja vezanih za ovo?
Does it make sense?
Da li vam ima smisla?
I can say what I think is the most dangerous version of this.
Mogu reći šta mislim da je najopasnija verzija ovoga.
That if you have a religious group,
ako imate religioznu grupu,
that proclaims a God who you are totally dependent on,
koja proglasi Boga od koga ste potpuno zavisni,
and will damn you to hell if you don't obey,
i koji će te proklesti da ideš u pakao ako mu se ne pokoriš,
you won't just get obedience to that God, but you will get love of that God.
Ne samo da ćeš dobiti poslušnost i poniznost prema tom Bogu, već ćeš osjećati ljubav prema tom Bogu.
So a lot of the more successful methods of religious recruitment are basically Stockholm syndrome.
Tako da je većina uspešnih religioznih regrutacija bazirana na stokholmskom sindromu.
Because it absolutely reliably creates a love of God.
Jer apsolutno pouzdano rekreira ljubav prema Bogu.
And often is geared towards people who feel alienated and have a background of a parent who is not available or rejected.
I obično usmjereno prema ljudima koji se osjećaju odbačeno i who had a parent?
Who's not available or rejected.
I koji su imali roditelja koji je bio nedostupan i odbacujući.
Bye. And as I said, I think that's a very dangerous idea.
I kao što sam rekao, to je nešto jako opasno.
But it comes straight out of this theory.
Ali izlazi iz ove teorije.
So are there any questions or comments on that?
Ima li nekih pitanja ili komentara vezanih za ovo?
Da li mogu da postavim pitanje vezano za undoing of the retroflection?
Can I ask a question about undoing of the retroflection?
Mm-hmm.
U pogledu rada sa retrofleksijom, uradi korak nazad i da se stane pred otpor i ostane pred otporom.
One of the ways working with retroflection is suggested to take a step back and to stand in front of the resistance and to stay
To stay
in front of the resistance
Not, da se ne ide kroz.
and not to go through it.
I don't see it really in terms of resistance.
Ja to ne vidim u terminima otpora.
As I said, that was the difference between Perls and Reich,
Kažem, to je, kao što sam već pomenuo, postojala je razlika između Perlsa i Reicha,
who saw it as tensions, which are retroflections, as a resistance to be gone through.
koji je tenzije koje su retrofleksije video kao otpor kroz koji treba proći.
And Perls saw it as being the result of two opposite impulses,
Dok je Perls to video kao rezultat dva suprotstavljena impulsa,
which are both real and important and needing attention.
koja su oba stvarna, bitna i potrebna im je pažnja.
He said, something is resisted and something is assisted by both.
On je rekao nešto se izbegava time, a nešto se je asistirano od strane ovog drugog.
Moje pitanje je u stvari da nam date nekoliko primjera, ako može još praktičnih, kako sve možemo načiniti korak u slučaju retrofleksije kao terapeut. Koje sve korake možemo uraditi? Znači kao primjer ilustracije.
Can you give us illustration or examples what can we do in front of retroflection with clients?
Kao prvi korak,
As a first step,
osim onog koji je naveo, još neke prosto asocijacije kuda bismo mogli da...
you mentioned one step, but maybe some other steps and associations. What can we do?
One step was about the green hair, okay. Znači još neki.
What I'm saying is that we're talking about hardwired inbuilt reflex.
Ono o čemu govorim jeste da imamo vrlo snažno utisnut i ugrađen refleks.
So there is nothing that needs to be done
Tako da ništa ne mora da se uradi.
apart from slowing down the process,
Osim usporavanja procesa,
giving either a movement or a voice to both impulses,
osim davanja pokreta ili glasa obema impulsima.
if somebody's got a tense back, you can ask them to slowly move forward and slowly move back, and just to notice their changing experience as they do that.
Ako neko ima napeta leđa, možete ih pozvati da se polako pomeraju napred i pomeraju nazad i samo da prate kako im se iskustvo menja dok to rade.
You can put their desire and their fear on two chairs.
Možete na dve stolice staviti s jedne strane želju, s druge strane strah.
All the kind of typical stuff.
Sve one tipične stvari.
But the point is to provide support for and re-own both those impulses as the activity of the self.
A stvar je naći podršku kako ponovo posjedovati oba impulsa kao aktivnosti selfa.
And then the retroflection disappears because it gets replaced by figure ground.
I onda retrofleksija nestaje i biva zamenjena figurom pozadinom, odnosno figure pozadine.
And then I would maybe say, okay, I understand you are desiring and you're frightened.
I onda bih rekao da razumem tvoje, da želiš, ali da si uplašen.
Which do you want to make your figure now?
A šta od ta dva želiš da postane figura sada, da učiniš figurom sada?
And you don't need to suppress the other. You can just say that is now in my background.
I nema potrebe da ovo drugo potiskuješ, već je dovoljno samo reći to je sad u mojoj pozadini.
Or say, which at this moment do you think supports your next step?
I možeš reći koje u ovom trenutku podržava tvoj sljedeći korak.
This is what I said yesterday, that the advantage of this much more complex theory is it supports a much simpler practice.
Ovo je ono što sam juče pomenuo, da prednost ovako komplikovane teorije je da podržava mnogo jednostavniju praksu.
I don't have to be a mechanic and do anything.
Ne moram da budem mehaničar i da radim bilo šta.
I just need to stay with what is.
Dovoljno je samo da ostanem sa onim šta jeste.
By the way, what's implicit in that is my understanding about two-chair work.
Inače, ono što je implicitno u tome je moje razumevanje rada sa dve stolice.
Which is that it's actually about 3 chairs and the third one is the one the therapist sits on.
Jer u stvari to je rad sa 3 stolice, a na trećoj stolici je ona na kojoj terapeut sedi.
So the client being is not that chair or that chair, but their dilemma of those two different impulses.
Dakle, klijent nije niti na jednoj stolici, niti na drugoj, već ta dilema koja se obavlja između te dve stolice. Ta dva impulsa.
And rather than that being played out as an internal drama or an internal muscular thing, it is now being shown as the self-activity to the therapist who can be with it.
I umjesto da se to odigrava kao unutrašnja drama, bilo kroz taj neki unutrašnji razgovor ili kroz tenziju u mišićima, sada može biti odigrano kao spoljašnja drama i to pred terapeutom.
And who is acknowledging of the significance of both to this person.
I koji će naglasiti značaj obe od ovih strana.
And in that way I can get to see the experiment of two-chair work, which is often seen as a kind of training in how to do something different, as being a dialogic thing with the therapist.
I zato ja mogu da posmatram rad sa dve stolice kao dijalošku stvar rada, a ne kao neki trening kako treba naučiti nešto.
As the client shows their very difficult unresolved dilemma to the therapist.
Kako klijent u stvari pokazuje svoju tešku i nerazrešenu dilemu terapeutu.
And that is the deepest level of the being of the client.
To je najdublji deo bivanja klijenta.
Does that make sense?
Da li to ima smisla?
But the whole idea of working to end a resistance doesn't fit in this approach at all.
Ali cijela ideja oko toga da je naš rad da završimo otpor se nikako ne uklapa u ovome što ja pričam.
Either it gets resolved by making a figure ground decision, which is important for me now.
Either?
Well, one possibility is that the client makes a figure ground decision.
Jedna od mogućnosti je da klijent napravi odluku na osnovu figure i pozadine šta je ono što je bitno meni sada.
Or the client turns it outward and opens a possibility of having a conflict with the therapist or in their world rather than with themselves.
Ili je druga da klijent to okrene s polja pa da uđe u konflikt bilo sa terapeutom ili sa spoljašnjim svetom pre nego sa sobom.
Because this is a story about a conflict over selfhood with parents being turned into an internal conflict.
Jer je ovo priča o konfliktu koji je bio s roditeljima, koji je sada okrenut da bude konflikt sa samim sobom.
Šta onda ukida stid iz spoljašnje sredine? To mi je ostalo nejasno.
So what triggers shame from the outside. That's what I'm not sure of.
Šta pokreće tu reakciju?
What starts that reaction?
Well, a situation where somebody is giving you something which is not yours and not nourishing, and you feel unable to say, no, fuck off.
Aha. A situaciju u kojima ti neko daje nešto što nije tvoje i što ti nije hranljivo, a ti nisi u stanju da mu kažeš odjebi.
And then you say it to yourself instead.
A onda umjesto toga to kažeš sebi.